Um, we're now going to get into a little bit more of um, the kind of engineering side of some of the conversations that we've been having today, and how do the technologies and infrastructure systems that we use support the exchange. And of course, not every not all problems are technological. So Sebastian and I will certainly get into some conversations about the uh, non-technical side of the engineering issues at play here. Um, so to start, Sebastian Hammer is co-founder and president of Index Data. Sebastian, I'll give you a couple minutes to introduce yourself and Index Data to the community before we dig into our conversation.
Sure. Um, let me approach it with a short personal story, and I because I always get a special kind of thrill or feel a little bit particularly honored when I share a stage or conversation with NISO. I've worked in libraries myself now for actually just about exactly 30 years today. My very first job, adult job, was for the Danish National Library Authority. And I got that job as a student worker because I needed work and I had no sense of what that would entail. And the very first day of work, my supervisor, my boss, gave me a pamphlet. And that pamphlet was ANSI NISO Z39.2. Although because it was in Denmark, we called it ISO 2709. And for those who don't know, it's the digital representation of bibliographic records on magnetic tape or other computer media, completely separate from the actual fields and subfields, but it's really the explanation for why that particular structure exists. And I took the thing home and I looked at the thing and I was like, I hate this stuff. This is just awful. There's nothing about this is good. I cannot make sense of it. And strangely enough, it ended up being pretty much my whole career, and I ended up becoming a massive fan of not just ISO 2709 and C39.2, but the whole complex of standards, in part because I was really blown away when I realized just how much libraries had accomplished and how aggressively they had run at interoperability between systems globally for such a long time before other industries had done so. So I started Index Data in 1994 with a friend from that same workplace. And essentially we started at Index Data because we wanted to do that kind of thing. We wanted to work in the spaces between libraries with the exchange of functionality and data between systems. Some of my very first work for the government had been building resource sharing systems and common catalogs. And I felt really comfortable in that space between libraries at that point. And it became our thing. And we discovered at Index Data somewhat by accident that open source software was this really natural complement to open standards, and developing and releasing open source software, enabled us to sit in rooms and set up projects and design products and come up with ideas together with other people. And that was really what had excited me about the work to begin with. And in some ways, my career has been about understanding those mechanisms better, sort of moving from saying, hey, I love this collaborative space. I love sitting down with people and having ideas and figuring out how that turns into code. And over the years, I think just realizing that you can refine those concepts. You realize that the software that you create can have a very, very long lifespan. I didn't used to think about it in these terms, but I realized that there were things that I made 25 years ago that still has a life today. And you kind of need to think that into how you approach building software. So I've always just lived and worked in that space between libraries and fueled by open standards in particular. And I feel like it's a space that's just really, really vibrant right now, because in some ways, I think that there are opportunities and ideas we have for trying to accomplish more than we have in the past, but there are also challenges to overcome to stimulate our attention.
It's a fascinating story. I'm just sitting here laughing all the time. in that context, right? We are building systems not to have systems. We're building systems to support patrons in their attempts to do something, to discover some information resource, so to get that book, watch that movie, whatever that resource is. Um, Over the years, that experience has shifted out of the library and into spaces that other communities control. You don't go to say if I'm looking for a journal article, I'm not generally going to the library to get that journal article. I am experiencing that journal article on a publisher's platform. It might be open access, it might be, or an ebook. The discovery of that ebook is often through other systems. How do we get back to a place where the library plays a central role in that patron experience?
I think it's a really good question, and it's a tricky one to answer because it's obviously a moving target. And it's been interesting to me over the past 10 years. I kind of feel like libraries spent a large part of the past 3 decades kind of chasing the vision of the single search box of the ultimate library catalog. And in a way, just as we sort of began to find out what that might look like, Google came along and became that for a lot of people. And that's just sort of one facet of how the patron experience is ultimately mediated by a lot of different organizations, and the patron's experience or the patron's expectations of access to information are informed by lots of different systems and companies and platforms outside of libraries. I think it is really critical for libraries to try to assert themselves or reassert themselves in that space, but it's also really important to be open-minded in terms of what that looks like, that it may be perfectly reasonable for somebody else to provide the discovery experience, but it may be important for the library to be part of understanding and interpreting the information that comes to them. I spoke to Jill, and I chatted a little bit earlier this week about your thoughts for this presentation, and one of the things that came to my mind is that there's an underlying story about what goes on with libraries and the library automation and access to information that has to do with the library and librarians becoming disintermediated in a sense. You talk about people accessing content on publisher platforms and so on. And I think that's actually a real risk. And it's not just a real risk to librarianship. I think it's a real risk to higher education. I think in the university, I think that libraries play a really unique and underappreciated role, being the organization and the people that really care about information literacy. And there's a way in which these platforms, the big ones and the smaller ones and the more specialized ones, by making it super easy to get to information really quickly, sometimes maybe lead people to lose track of how you actually learn to be critical of the information that you consume. And I'd love to see libraries find ways to insert themselves into the flow and to be able to help guide people towards making better choices about what they consume and how they use it and how they find it and so on. But that means that they have to be in the loop, right? So a lot of the projects and the work that we are involved with lately, and I should have probably have said this earlier, but I've spent the past 4 or 5 years deeply engaged in the Folio Library Service Platform project and working with Jill Morris actually on Project Reshare, thinking about resource sharing of all kinds between libraries. It's critical to find ways that libraries can insert themselves into the flows of information. And for me, that creates kind of a pressure to try to open up some of those platforms that we talk about and figuring out ways that libraries can get at some of the data and can get at some of the processes, but to do it with the patron in mind. So this also requires libraries to really dive deeply into what the patron actually needs. What are the needs for the patron? What are the types of workflows that the library needs to engage in and support to meet those patron needs? And what are their strategic needs for understanding what goes on? And this goes back to Christina's really awesome presentation too. This notion of how do we ensure that libraries have access to all of the data coming out of and being created in all of these different platforms, so they can make smart decisions about what services they make available, what products they consume, and how they manage over time the life cycle of the material that they consume and that they buy. Just as with software, yeah, you get the thing, but that's not the end of the life. 10 years later, you might look at that material and say, hey, that's not really being used. Or it's being used not very much, or we could enable better use of it through some other medium than it's sitting on a shelf somewhere. How do you enable libraries to do that, and to do it at scale, and to do it in the face of shrinking budgets as well? So yeah, that the last piece of it also means that increasingly this is not just something that goes on in the library, that it's critically important for libraries to be able to work together and to approach some of these things as consortia or in ad hoc collaborations, in projects or in long-term collaborations, whether that is acquisition or resource sharing, or doing collaborative projects that let them share their resources and their work.
Yeah. So many paths to dig into from this. One of the things that you were talking about is the insinuation of the library in the patron experience, which I find really fascinating, because over the last several years, I mean, last several decades actually, the library took many decisions about trying to remove itself from the patron experience. IP authentication is one example, where you try to just make it simple, make it magical. The user doesn't even know that there is a subscription to this resource until they go off campus and can't get access to it. I'm like, oh, the library paid for that? How do you see, how can libraries try and provide that intermediary service without creating barriers like an extra click through, or, you know, make it difficult so that someone just throws up their hands and goes, I want to go to Google and take me to Sci-Hub, because that's just easier.
So I think this is where the emergence of those big platforms have created both obstacles and also inspiration. Because I don't know that anyone really knew how all of this would turn out, right? That everybody has been on a journey for the past 25 years with the evolution of the World Wide Web and the internet, and nobody particularly knew what kind of role Google would end up playing in the big picture. We had no clue. People were just trying to feel their way along. And there has been, as you say, a move that has had at least the side effects, if it wasn't exactly intentional, of disintermediating the library. There has been an entirely practical and smart move from locally operated systems that communicated to a certain extent using open standards to software as a service, cloud-hosted systems as the network became efficient and reliable enough to allow that, to these platforms. And we see those platforms both within libraries and within scholarly communication. And we see them out in the world, where Google and Facebook have come to own substantial parts of our public space. And I think just as there is a realization in the larger world that it's not necessarily to the best of our interest to have a commercial platform own some massive swath of the commons, the space where we come together and talk to each other and work together. without any kind of control by us, the citizens of those commons. It's just happened. Nobody planned it that way, right? Nobody knew that there would be, you know, if Tim Berners-Lee had engineered the World Wide Web as a social platform rather than as a document delivery platform, this might have unfolded completely differently. And it might have been assumed that there was a digital identity that you could carry around with you from platform to platform, and that you would have ownership of your own data, that it wouldn't be owned by these commercial platforms. It just happened that way. But we are in a place right now where I think we can look at those platforms, and those platforms allow for functionality and for collaboration and for things we hadn't imagined 20 or 30 years ago. That's inspiring, right? You can do things in terms of collaboration between libraries that share a platform, and the company or the organization that owns that platform can enable all kinds of things that we might not have imagined then. Now we're in a place where I think that it's relevant to say, well, what if we could do those things? What if we were not, we want all those things we can do within that platform. We want to be able to talk to our parents on Facebook. We want to be able to collaborate, do consortial interlending between our libraries, but we don't want to be forced to all have to be on the same platform, to all have our data be owned by the same commercial entity or whatever to do this. So I actually think that a lot of what I see as sort of an inspiration for the next generation of standards work would be, how do we recreate some of that functionality? How do we take the platforms and bust them open? What would that actually look like? And to do it from a standpoint of what we know to be, our best understanding of patron needs and library workflow needs, what would it actually look like to engineer a set of standards that would enable the whole network and open ecosystem of different types of players to provide the same level of seamless experience that we want for the patrons, the same level of deep collaboration between organizations, but in an open ecosystem. And I think what's interesting is that the platforms, on the one hand, provide kind of a blueprint, because they've shown us the way in some cases in terms of, hey, all these things you can do when everybody sits in the same database, all these things that are really easy to engineer when everybody is in the same space. What does it look like to bust that open? And part of that is designing the right kinds of data models and the right kinds of protocols. And a huge part of it is figuring out how you do distribute trust across systems so that you can move data around between different entities in a way that people can feel comfortable with, both in terms of commercially important information and very much in terms of personally important information. So I just feel like we're being challenged right now, and also somewhat inspired to try to think of the network as the platform. In my mind, the term that keeps coming back to me is open platform thinking. You know, moving between, you know, from open systems was the thing that we used to do, where we sort of tried to establish some minimum level of interoperability between systems. And now it's the question of, how do we turn the whole thing into a platform where we have some ownership of what goes on, what gets moved around, and what we can do. Once you start to think of it that way, I think it becomes a little bit more clear what the pieces are you have to invent, and what already exists in terms of standards that are out there, and what's missing. And you can start to tackle it from that perspective. I'd just like to see I'd like to see all the benefits and the value that platforms already brings, but I like to just kind of recognize, I think, the realization that we all have that it's not desirable for the platforms themselves to define these barriers, to become walled gardens that, hey, you can have all these benefits, but only if everybody in your cohort chooses to use the same products, if you will.
Yeah, and as you mentioned earlier, there's an increasing interest in collaboration, in institutions working together. There are a variety of initiatives, and I touched on this very briefly in my introduction, about cooperative collections development initiatives. Like we'll be talking with Maurice in a few minutes about the Big Ten efforts. there are a variety of other initiatives like reshare. There's push towards controlled digital lending and the digital sharing ecosystem. And we don't want to only work with organizations. We shouldn't envision a world where there is one library system that every library uses, as much as vendor A, B, C, or D would like to be that single source vendor. There will always be multiple suppliers of these systems. Um, how do you envision those libraries interacting together, in a technological way, but also, kind of how do we avoid this vendor lock-in?
So there is observer bias here on my part, but I could not agree more. I think it is in nobody's interest. I would actually argue it's not even in vendor A, B, or C's interest to become the sole supplier, because it has just never worked well to have a single supplier. It's as a transplant to America, I'd say, capitalism breaks down when you only have a single supplier. That's not a good thing. We don't want to be there. It's good to have a marketplace of ideas. It's good to have conversations. I think that the real key, and I guess what I discovered over the past few years, as I grooved on those conversations, those creative conversations about creating software and how to figure out how to make those conversations better and more creative, and less likely to produce something that already existed in some slightly different color. We sort of gradually started to learn something about what community ownership of a space really looks like. That at least was new to me. And in Reshare, Jill and I and others kind of came up with a model for what I think of as community-owned product management, where you get together different stakeholders and you establish models of communication and community behavior, where you are very deliberately not just focusing on engineering and not just focusing on the patron experience, but you try to get the whole picture into a place and you provide shared ownership for different levels of that conversation. So there are people in organizations that have a strategic perspective of where libraries are moving, where individual libraries are moving, and where we're moving as a group. There are people who have a deep understanding of the needs of patrons. There are people who have a deep understanding of the needs of libraries and the need of librarians to be able to do their work effectively and not spend their time doing monkey work, pushing things around, when they can be doing the stuff that's really critical. How do you establish those conversations? And I think having models for setting up that type of community ownership of different parts of this big open platform is absolutely critical. And what we ended up borrowing was a lot of what I think had been learned about the governance of large open source projects. Well, you do have to have a communal responsibility for the movement of something that spanned many different kinds of stakeholders. And standards creates, and open source software both create a kind of neutral space where vendors, service providers, and libraries can sit around the same table and share ideas. I think it's critical to have that space, and it's extremely critical to have libraries as the consumers sitting at that space, because they are the people who, and they have to understand it, they have to be literate in these types of things, and they have to know to expect them. One of the things that kind of limited interoperability and frustrated efforts in the past was that it tended to become the process of maintaining these standards and supporting this ecosystem tended to become somewhat abstract, a little church-like. The documents were deliberately very dry, very, very far removed from the actual need and application and the motivating factors. And so it was actually really hard to convince people that this was a worthwhile thing for them to ask for when they purchased the system, because it was also abstract and far removed. Ownership or community ownership of the roadmap and technology means that libraries do have to engage. They have to work together in consortia to leverage their efforts because most libraries are obviously too small to get deep into a lot of these things, and that's why collaborations become so critical. But it's setting up the community structures to own this from a strategy perspective, from a functional expertise perspective, from a patron needs perspective, from a software development perspective, and doing that over time.
Right. I want to focus in on one particular problem and use it kind of as a use case for this idea and some of the things you've been talking about. During the NISO Plus conference in February, one of the top ideas for NISO activities was developing some standards and best practices around controlled digital lending and where that fit in the space of libraries. Based on what we've just talked about, let's use that as an example.
Mm-hmm.
What sort of systems needs exist with regard to controlled digital lending? And in what ways is controlled digital lending like traditional circulation or like traditional ILL? And in what ways do we need to expand our systems for this new service model?
Sure. I think controlled digital lending, first of all, is super, super exciting. I think it is incredibly important, and it's shown itself to be a really critical tool for libraries to provide services during the pandemic. But it's also really interesting because basically the white paper, the legal theory behind controlled digital lending, which is that the library has the rights through the purchasing something under copyright law and fair use to lend that material digitally. That puts control of the whole experience right back in the hands of the library. There's not a content owner that has licensed something to the library that has ownership of the platform. The library is somewhat free to figure out what this means, to figure out what the patron experience should be, to figure out how it fits into the larger picture. To take an example to make it more concrete, there have been, I think, literally hundreds of controlled digital lending experiments taking place through the pandemic. A lot of them have been focused on course reserves and circulating limited bits of material. And in some cases, it has been a question of enabling access to a whole collection for those libraries that are part of Hati Trust, part of Hati during the pandemic when the collections were just shut down. But for CDL to be part of everyday use, you really have to start to think of it as something that exists in parallel with other modes of resource access, right? So you have to be able to say, I've got this material here. I want to be able to lend it physically or digitally, whatever is more convenient or whatever serves the needs of my patron better. That means that there is a need to think CDL as a model into how you interact with the library management system. I think it will probably mean that as we go forward, it would be great if there was a model for acquisitions that let us say, hey, I want to enable CDL as an access model for this material I'm buying. But you need to be able to support a representation of that in your library management system. You need to be able to model and implement the policies that say, how am I circulating this? For how long? What are my restrictions of usage? What might be my cooling down period when the material comes back and go out again? All of this stuff you need to be able to represent in a system, and ideally not in a system that is separate from everything else that goes on in the library, but integrated into how you manage your collection. You need to be able to manage the physical workflows of taking the thing off the shelf and possibly having it scanned and then putting it aside someplace until the digital material has been quote unquote returned. All of these things need to be supported. And finally, to my mind, I think it's critically important to figure out how CDL fits into the larger picture of resource sharing, because there is while CDL can enable libraries to deliver materials much more effectively directly to where the patron is, there's also additional work. There's workload required, and the most realistic way to cope with that work is to share it among consortium members. So working it into standards like ISO 18626 and figuring out what it looks like, and how you deal with a scenario where one library might own the physical copy of a thing, another library might own a digital scan. How do you bring those things together so that you can get it to the patron? Those are some of the questions that need to be answered. And how does that fit into discovery, and how does it align with long-term print retention, use of offsite, high-density storage, and all this kind of stuff?
Yeah. And back to this question of interoperability, what are the systems needs? What are the systems, how are the systems communicating or not about the status, about the, the location, the circulation? And I'm thinking, in kind of circling this back to the controlled digital lending world, where you have, instead of having a silo where my own LMS, my own management systems know what is circulating at my institution, if you are in a a cooperative sharing agreement, you need to know what's available in institution X, which is also a member of my cooperative. How do we overcome the lack of communication about those sort of traditional internal data issues?
I think that we can have a whole, another hour spent talking about shared catalogs and challenges of knowing when you're talking about the same material in two different places, and how far in some ways we still are from having that really work well. But I think we need to understand, so part of the necessary infrastructure for a consortium that engage in resource sharing is a shared understanding of what is held by the consortium, right? Both in terms of the bibliographic metadata and in some detailed way about holdings. And that notion of holdings needs to be extended to a notion that, hey, I have this available in a form, so I can give it to you digitally. And what does that look like? And hey, I have it in that form, but I've already lent it to this other library. And they have now kind of taken control of the token for that one thing. That digital entitlement, they've taken it, they're using it right now, so I can't, but I'm going to get it back at some points. So I think it points to a need for tightening, and it challenges to kind of tighten some of the mechanisms that already exist, all the way from exchanging metadata to integrations with the library management system through NSIP or whatever, to saying there may be entirely new endpoints that we need to kind of support understanding these things. I think consortial collaboration and the notion of the virtualized collection in general just open up, they open up kind of a whole set of really interesting challenges and a push for us to tighten up what gets pushed around between systems in terms of bibliographic metadata.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and by tighten, I'm guessing, what do you mean by tighten? Rather than guessing what you mean?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a journey we've been on. So I started this by saying I fell in love with Mark 21 and the representation on magnetic tape, right? It is taking us a long time to move on from what was essentially a representation of library catalog cards in a digital realm. It's taking us a long time, and it's taking us in some ways too long. And I think in some ways there are still places where we have the same arguments about identifiers and identifiability that we used to have, decades ago, and that's just no good. I think that there is a critical need for us to be better at knowing when we're all talking about the same thing. So getting better at identifying instances of things and works for that matter. And there's a critical need for us to get tighter about modeling things like locations and holdings and policies. There are a lot of things hidden in the different corners of our catalogs that are still strings, or that are conventions enforced by a library system or even by an individual library, just in terms of policy, where there is a need for us to define vocabulary. We've talked in recent, I think, meetings we've both been in, Todd, recently, about the need to define vocabulary for certain aspects of policies. Like, yeah, I will lend this thing to you because you're this kind of library, or I will lend it to you for these types of students. I will lend it to you under these restrictions. I think those things need to be captured as shared vocabulary so that they're not so system dependent, and so they're not so locally specific, because that gets in the way of collaboration.
Yeah, definitely. So many more threads I could go down with you, Sebastian. We are a little past our time. This has been a great conversation. For those who are not aware, some of the things that we have been talking about in the last half hour, as I mentioned, controlled digital lending was one of the big ideas coming out of NISO Plus that the NISO topic committees are interested in pursuing and developing standards around. And based on the conversation we've just had with Sebastian, there are a lot of areas of potential work for standardization around practice, definitions, vocabularies. These are all things that watch the space. NISO will probably be moving forward with later this spring, later this summer. So with that, we'll draw this portion of the program to a close. Sebastian, thank you so much for talking with us. Always good to talk to you.
Thank you.